Welcome to the 6th meeting of the Committee on Scottish Government Handling of Harassment Complaints. Our first item of business is a follow-up evidence session with the Permanent Secretary after her initial appearance before the Committee on 18th August. This follow-up session will focus on Phase 1 of the inquiry, which is on the development of the handling of harassment complaints procedure. Can I remind all those present and watching that we are bound by the terms of our remit and the relevant court orders, including the need to avoid contempt of court by identifying certain individuals, including through jigsaw identification. The committee as a whole has also agreed that it is not our role to revisit events that were a focus of the trial that could be seen to constitute a rerun of the criminal trial. Our remit is to consider and report on the actions of the First Minister, Scottish Government officials and special advisers in dealing with complaints about Alex Salmond, former First Minister, considered under the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints involving current or former ministers and procedure and actions in relation to the Scottish Ministerial Code. The more we get into specifics of evidence, that is time, people, cases, the more we run the risk of identifying those who made complaints. The more we ask about specific matters covered in the trial, including events explored in the trial, the more we run the risk of rerunning the trial. Wherever possible, can witnesses, as well as members, please avoid discussion of the specifics of concerns or complaints, including those that predated the harassment complaints procedure being produced, and also avoid naming specific government officials. With that, can I welcome the Permanent Secretary, Leslie Evans, and begin by inviting Ms Evans to take the solemn affirmation. If you would raise your right hand, please, Ms Evans, and repeat after me. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm.
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm.
That I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
That I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming along again today. This is very much a continuation of the last session. I'll therefore go first to Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Ms Evans. I wonder if I could pick up where we left an issue hanging at the end of the last meeting. And I wonder if I could ask you, without going into any individual cases, are you aware of any changes in working practices as a result of concerns that were expressed by staff around behaviour, including the behaviour of ministers? And if so, what changes were they?
No. I'm not aware of those changes. I wouldn't necessarily be aware of those changes unless I was particularly close to that office. That's not to say that changes don't take place, but I'm not aware of any specifics. I'm not sure if you're talking about specifics, but I appreciate we don't want to necessarily get into those.
You're not personally aware of that?
No.
Okay, thank you. We heard from the trade unions when they came to give us evidence last week that they were aware of a number of situations where, rather than trying to resolve them, what happened in the civil service was the individuals raising concerns were simply moved to a different position or a different department or working for a different minister. Is that something you're aware of?
I'm aware that there is usually, if there is a local issue within an office or between individuals, we work as hard as we can to ensure that that is resolved informally. That's nearly always the best way. That might be through a range of processes. That could be through mediation, it could be through support from HR, it could be through a third party being introduced of some kind. And it may sometimes be that that can't be resolved in the way that we would like it to be. So moving people around in jobs, as you know, and those of you who are ministers will know, that happens quite frequently anyway, usually after a few years. So I wouldn't say it was a traditional route. I think it's an option, but I think our preference will always be to ensure that we can first spot and prevent, but secondly, if not, resolve through a range of informal mechanisms, which includes mediation and conversations of that kind.
Okay, so in those cases, these wouldn't necessarily escalate to a formal complaint being made. They would be dealt with on a more informal basis.
Wherever possible, I think the best practice is to try and resolve things informally, and that's the approach that we've taken. That's what our policies reflect. Indeed, it's named in that way, both in the Fairness at Work and in the 2017 process. So wherever possible, we would try and ensure that we look at an informal resolution, mediation, conversations, support, identifying any additional support that's required.
We heard last week from the trade unions concerns about the level of complaints or the level of concerns that have been raised with them, which in relation to the rest of the civil service seem to be very high in the Scottish Government. I mean, can you give us a flavour of, from your experience within the civil service, is there a particular issue in the Scottish Government that's more acute than other parts of the civil service?
I found that quite puzzling, which is not to say I'm complacent by any means. I mean, I think you're right to differentiate between concerns and complaints. Complaints normally means we've triggered the formal procedure. Two or three things. First of all, I didn't recognise, I think there were some quite specific numbers that the FDA in particular brought out, and numbers of ministers and numbers of complaints over a period of time of something like 10 years. I wasn't sure from that evidence which 10 years that was, and there was talk about multiple administrations, quite a lot of conversation around all of that. I simply didn't recognise that in terms of hard data that we have now, particularly going back to the People Survey of 2019. That doesn't reflect that organisation to me. As I said earlier on, we have very, very few formal complaints. In fact, over the past 10, 13 years, we've only had a handful. So for the majority of the time, I would expect informal complaints and concerns rather than complaints to be raised in the line, as we would say, with a line manager, or producing support from HR, or indeed through the union, which is a perfectly respectable and appropriate route for people to raise. In fact, they may prefer to go to the union than go to somebody that they know about in HR. I understand that completely. So many of these will have been resolved quite rightly by somebody saying, I'm concerned about this, I want you to hear what I have to say. That's not to say that we should then sit and watch that emerge. We still need to be taking action, predominantly preventative. And I would say that the data that we've got at the moment coming through shows perhaps that we have an increased appetite for people being prepared to name these bullying and harassment concerns than other parts of the UK civil service. And indeed, I think it was Dave Penman from the FDA himself who raised the point that actually he feels that the Scottish Government has done more in this area than either the House of Commons or the Cabinet Office.
Thank you. Were you, or are you currently the reporting or counter-signing officer for annual reporting of complaints?
I would have to check that. It would normally go through the head of HR, and then it would go to the person who's responsible for all corporate procedures, which is the Director General in charge of that area. But clearly, if there is an issue or if there is a reporting process to go through, I would be informed about that.
But would there normally be such a process?
There would be somebody who would be aware of and have the responsibility for checking on data and reporting of that kind, yes.
Thank you. And just one final question, Convener, if I can. Did you personally ever experience bullying behaviour in your career as a civil service? Were you ever on the receiving end of, for example, shouting from a minister?
I think over my career as a whole, I have had people shout at me. I suspect there are very few people here who haven't, and that includes the civil service.
From ministers?
Are you asking me, have ministers ever shouted at me? Yes.
They have. So,
Yes.
Does that concern you?
Well, I think we need to put this into context. People, I'm not suggesting that this is a daily occurrence. What I am suggesting is that...
I'm conscious we have some former ministers around the table.
We do indeed. We do indeed. And I've worked with many, if not all of them, actually. I think the point is we're talking about, firstly, a unique relationship between civil servants and ministers. It is unlike anything else. That's not to say it doesn't have conditions and criteria governing it, of course, of good behaviour. But I think if you asked anybody who'd worked in any organisation, have you ever had a conversation with somebody else and has that ended up with some shouting? Not very often, but it has happened. And I understand that people are passionate, committed, and very hard-working in both the civil service and the ministers that I have worked with as well. However, I think there is a line to be drawn, and I would draw it, between passion, commitment, and the occasional losing of temper. And where behaviour crosses that line, that's different.
And did it ever, in your experience?
In terms of people shouting at me, no.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Maureen Watt. Now, please don't shout at Miss Evans.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to say that when I resigned as a minister, Miss Evans actually wrote me a note saying how well I had dealt with staff. So there are both sides of the coin among ministers. That's it, yeah.
Thank you,
Alex
Ms. Watt.
Cole-Hamilton.
Convener, good morning, Ms Evans. Thank you very much for coming back to see us. 2 weeks ago, we learned from James Hind that, in his words, things were said to him as part of an informal hum of rumours about bullying and sexually inappropriate behaviour by Alex Salmond and other ministers. When did you first pick up on those rumours circulating around Mr Salmond's behaviour?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. You're talking about James saying that there was water cooler.
Water cooler conversations. It was the scuttlebutt at the time. When did you first pick up on those rumours?
I can't comment on when I picked up on rumours. I understand there were rumours,
You knew
but I
about it?
can't. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, I did.
Just to bookend Modo Fraser's last question, did Mr Salmond ever shout at you?
Did he ever?
Shout at you?
I don't remember him shouting at me.
Okay. In his submission, Sir Peter Housden told us that he would deal with allegations of bullying and harassment by ministers personally and informally when he was Permanent Secretary. As a Director General at the time, did he ever discuss that quiet handling of concerns about ministers, either formally or informally, with yourself?
We had conversations about conversations that I had had with individuals about Mr Salmond's behaviour.
Okay, thank you. You replaced Peter Housden as Permanent Secretary in the summer of 2015. Did you have any kind of handover with him prior to you taking over?
Yes. In fact, I took over on the 1st of July, but I was aware of my appointment 3 or 4 weeks before that, so we were working quite closely together, although I was still Director General.
And we all know that with a handover, there's always a formal bit and an informal bit. In the informal bit, you might be told where the bodies were buried, quote unquote. As part of that, did he ever discuss either formally or informally with you how you might need to handle complaints against ministers and how he'd done that in the past and how you might need to take that forward?
I don't recall that.
Okay. And did he ever offer examples of occasions that he had raised concerns with ministers about their behaviour?
I don't recall that particularly, no.
Okay.
He may have done, I don't remember it, no.
And my final question in the session, Convener, is have you in your 5 years as Permanent Secretary ever had to take similar action and handle concerns on an informal basis with ministers about their behaviour?
Yes, informally, yes. As I said earlier on, there are very few formal complaints that have come through. I think 3 since 2007.
Included to the satisfaction of the person that had raised the concerns?
I think informal resolution is always going to be difficult, invest a lot of time on both parties, but my intention would always be to ensure that people are comfortable about the informal resolution. And of course, if it's not, they have the option to move that into formal process.
And could you quantify that in any way? How many times that's happened where you've had to address
I
problems?
can't
with the
really
minister?
quantify it over 5 years. It's not a frequent occurrence, but it is one that I pay attention to.
So just a handful of times, or would it be more frequent than that?
Yeah, I would say it's probably around that a handful of times. It's part of the day, it's part of the warp and weft of how an organisation works, relationships, both between ministers and civil servants, but between civil servants as well, of course.
Okay, thank you very much.
Angela Constance.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to Ms Evans. You'll recall that the committee has requested a separate written statement that provides information about the investigation under the procedure. Now, we've had correspondence from the DFM explaining that that's been delayed. I just wondered if you could advise committee now when we can expect that information.
I think the DFM has said that he will come back to us on that. I mean, I can't give you an exact date at the moment.
Okay, but given that you're the principal policy advisor for the Scottish Government, do you have any inkling? Can you give us any reassurance that the information will be forthcoming in the not too distant future?
Well, we'd always want to make sure that things happened in the not too distant future, as you would understand. But I think the issue that we have is that we're taking legal advice about options available at the moment, so we would need to come back to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't make any assumptions about what I understand. Okay, my second question, Ms Evans, is how confident are you that the review of the Scottish Government's harassment complaints procedure, that will be completed by the end of the year? I think in correspondence you'd intimated that it could be extended, but again, can you give us some confidence as to when that work will be completed?
I mean, the work will be undertaken by Ms Dunlop, as you know, although supported by senior civil servants. So it will be very much at her hands as to how long she feels the need is to take the review. I would prefer it to be not too long, not least because we're keen to learn from what Ms Dunlop's analysis produces in the way of recommendations, and we have our own lessons to learn as well. Which I would like to combine with that and obviously what comes out of the inquiry as well, so that we can make sure that we have the best assessment of what we need to reflect on and the recommendations that are available for us to consider. So I would prefer it to be sooner rather than later, but it is very much and quite rightly in the hands of the person who is undertaking the review, Ms Dunlop.
But I think the correspondence had intimated by the end of the year.
I would be delighted if it was by the end of the year.
Okay, thank you. And my final question is that the ninth version of the policy, or the ninth iteration of the policy that was recast by Ms Richards on the 5th of December. I wonder if you can just confirm for the record, Ms Evans, that that version says that with respect to former ministers, the Permanent Secretary will decide whether the complaint is well-founded and also determine what action is required.
I think if that is the final, I can't say that I have it off the top of my head. If that is the final text, it would be what we apply in terms of the procedure as is now.
Okay, thank you.
Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder, Permanent Secretary, if you have had a chance to look at the evidence that the unions have given us last week, and whether you would have any reflections on some of what they said about the development of the policy. I'm thinking particularly about the emphasis which they put on how they felt an independent element to the whole process that we're talking about would have been helpful.
Yes, I think it's helpful to dwell on the point of independence generally, actually, because it's been talked about quite a lot. And starting with the unions, I understand from HR, did raise in dialogue with HR colleagues the issue of independence, but it didn't form part of their substantial or substantive amendments and evidence to the things that they would like to change as part of the complaints. And I don't think they raised it as part of the proposal of work during the fairness at work considerations either. So although I believe it was raised, it was not part of their substantive changes. And my understanding is we took 80% of their proposals for changes on board in either spirit or word for word. Now, that's not to say, of course, that there aren't opportunities. And I know that since that time, the FDA have been, in particular, I think, quite vociferous about the element of independence in these kinds of procedures. And I think they would claim that their pressure on the Westminster procedure, the procedure that is now operating there, that has been revised in accordance with that. And since 2019, I think independence does play an element within that procedure. But although it was raised, it was not part of the substantive changes that they wanted to see within the procedure.
One of the arguments that the unions made around this was that while an independent element early on in the process wouldn't be normal in another workplace, the unusual situation of the workplace in government with ministers who don't have a normal employment relationship with the people working around them would have been merited. Do you think looking back, that it would have been helpful to have introduced that into the process?
Well, I agree that it is a unique relationship, and it is unusual for any employer to introduce independence into a procedure of that kind. Normally that comes after the initial exploration and investigation. And I think the other points that I would make is there are issues of trust and confidentiality and encouraging complainants to come forward, and an independence element, depending on when it comes into the procedure, may have an impact on that. And of course, when we produced and developed the procedure, we were very cognizant of Police Scotland advice on confidentiality and indeed on a complainant-centred policy. I would also say as well that my understanding is that the inquiry into bullying and harassment in the House of Lords found that a complaint being referred to the Commission for Standards was a nuclear option. It was described in the face of which members would close ranks. So I think it depends on the point and the stage. But I'm aware, and we were talking earlier on about the review by Ms Dunlop, may well reflect on independence becoming part of the procedure in the future, or in how it is applied. So I am open to the recommendations of that review, and if independence does come into that, it would be something that we would need to think very carefully about. I agree.
The other question that the unions raised about the development of the process was probably their unenthusiastic reaction to the system by which the government introduced lived experience into the development of the process. Again, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at what they said about that, but I wonder if either at the time or on reflection, you would have any view about what they said about some of their questions about how and when lived experience was introduced into that process of development.
So I think one of the things that we probably need to get correct here is where lived experience, as I mentioned before, is an important part of a policy development process, so is part of this, and would be part of this. But actually our main concern, and I think this came up in Nikki Richards' evidence, is to ensure that we traditionally test procedures with staff who are likely to be using them. Now, admittedly, this was in draft process at that point, but it was very important for, and is part of our traditional practice, I understand in HR terms and professional terms, to allow people to understand what will happen if they take a particular decision or decide to go down a particular route. So lived experience is still a valid and important part of how we develop policy in the Scottish Government as a whole. But actually in the circumstances in which this was shared was very much also to do with people being clear about what might happen, what the procedures would be, what to expect if they were to decide. And some did decide to turn their concerns into complaints, and some did not. But it was important that they knew what would unfold if they did.
Thank you, Convener.
Jackie Bailey.
Very much, Convener, and welcome back, Miss Evans. At our last session, you referenced an incident in which Sky News were interested and there was contact by the former First Minister of Staff. Can you tell me when you told the First Minister about this? Was it just verbally? Was there anybody else in the room? And what was the outcome of that?
It was early on in November, and it was verbally.
Was there anybody else in the room?
I can't remember, to be honest. I really can't remember.
Okay, so there could have been, but
There
okay,
might have been.
That's helpful. Okay, was one of the staff members who reported the contact by the former First Minister with regard to the Sky News interest, were they one of the complainers?
Not to my knowledge at that time. I came to know about the Sky issue through two different sources. One person who had been contacted and another who hadn't, but had known that people had been contacted. So at that time, those were the two routes through which I was alerted to this.
Okay, let me just be clear, because you said not to your knowledge at that time. Did any of them go on to be complainers?
I suppose I'm differentiating between then and now.
Yep.
So then I had no knowledge.
No, but I'm asking you...
Now I do.
Yes, so one of them went on to be a complainer.
I'm absolutely not sure about that, to be fair. I'm not sure. I'm choosing my words carefully, not
I
to be
understand
unhelpful, but to try and be alert
Okay.
to
I mean,
the
I would
constraints.
be happy if you wrote back to the committee with that clarification.
I'm happy
if
to do
would be
that,
helpful.
yes.
Thank you. Can I move on? You said to us a number of times in our last session, and I quote, "I was not close to the procedure development as you would expect." You appear to have, well, you've certainly given me the impression of distancing yourself from the development of the policy and the procedure, and I'm sure you didn't mean to do that, because the documents we've seen tell quite a different story. So we have James Hind reporting to you, HR were in regular discussion with you, keeping you informed. You were making comments on the draft procedure as it developed. Your private secretary was in email discussion with the First Minister's Chief of Staff. You know, there's a lot of activity. Indeed, you met directly with the First Minister to approve her letter of commission of the 22nd of November. So on that basis, and given you were a key decision maker within the policy, isn't the truth that you were actually driving the process, as I would expect, because it was a commission from Cabinet?
No, because the person who was driving the process is the person who is also the lead responsible officer for completing the task, particularly with something so important as a Cabinet commission. If I was leading and involved in every Cabinet commission that came out of Cabinet, I wouldn't have time for very much else. So there's a process of delegation, and James Hind was driving that process, and of course was keeping, as well as taking regular advice, as you know, from previous evidence from HR and from legal. I was kept abreast of what was going on there, importantly for two reasons. One was it's a Cabinet commission, so I would be kept abreast of it because it was something which was very particular and very high profile, so that's understandable. But secondly, because I featured within, and my role featured within the procedure. So that would have been normal. But to say that I'm trying to sort of distance myself, no, it was a perfectly normal and traditional way of keeping me abreast of something which was important and also on the First Minister's radar. And things which are on the First Minister's radar or pronounced on the First Minister's radar are something which are important to me, of course.
Absolutely. But there's nothing I've said about those interactions that was incorrect.
Well, that people were briefing me and that I was having
Absolutely.
meetings with them.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
Okay,
that would
that's
be
fine.
a normal part of daily life.
Okay.
I think I should point out as well, of course, that neither James Hyde nor Nicky Richards report to me. They're reporting to their own line managers on the business of their work.
There were numerous emails backwards and forwards with either you or your private secretary.
My private secretary and my private office were very heavily involved in it on my
Yes.
behalf, as they
Yes.
are with most of the business that
Absolutely.
I undertake. Yes.
Yes, but a private office is the extension of the minister. Having been a minister, I know that that's how it operates.
They undertake
Can I-
work on my behalf on a regular
Sure.
basis, indeed.
Can I move us on to the potential complainants? Were you aware that potential complainants were actually informed that Judith McKinnon would be appointed as the investigating officer weeks before the policy was even signed off and more than a month before her appointment was actually made?
I was aware that she was having contact before she was appointed as investigating officer, as indeed the procedure enabled and recognised. So I was not aware that she was talking to them closer to hand about the fact that she would be investigating officer, but I was aware that she was following the procedure, as she would do, impartially, appropriately and professionally, in talking and supporting, mostly, any people with concerns who may decide to turn those into complaints about the options that they had and that were available to them at any one time, including how the procedure would move on.
Okay. And my final question, Convener, to the Permanent Secretary is, in your previous evidence and indeed in his, James Hind was the first person to decide to propose a policy for former ministers, despite it not being mentioned in the Cabinet on the 31st of October, or indeed the parliamentary statement of the same date. As I understand it, the first draft or the first iteration of the new policy specifically on former ministers was on November the 8th. And we know that James Hind sent that directly to you on November the 10th in an email. But can I ask you, is it not the case that you and your office had discussions with Judith McKinnon and Julie McFadgen on the question of producing a route map, including former ministers, on November the 7th, a day before? And that route map was sent to James Hind on November the 7th, who replied to you, as I understand it, at 21:24 on the 7th of November. If that's correct, can we see the route map, any minutes, any correspondence relevant to this? Because unfortunately, I don't seem to be able to find that at all in the information the government has supplied to us. And that is of great concern. So could you advise whether actually that is correct?
There's a lot of dates and information there. I can tell you two things, which I think I mentioned before in my previous evidence. The decision to include former ministers came from an analysis which was already underway, work which had already been undertaken on the fairness at work procedure. So from the very beginning, it was agreed that to use a colloquialism, the tidying up, the consistency making of the fairness at work would always be addressing the issue of former ministers. In terms of the route map, I'm surprised if the route map hasn't been shared with as part of our paperwork, because it was heavily promoted as part of showing people which routes were best for them to choose, including going to unions and other places, for them to gain support if they wish to raise a concern of this nature. So if the route map, as produced, hasn't been shared with the committee, I see no reason why we shouldn't send that to you.
It's not just the route map, it's the exchange of correspondence. So on the 7th of November, a day before the first iteration of the policy, you were asking about former ministers in the context of the route map, and that was an instruction that was sent to James Hind, or the route map was shared with James Hind. He replied on the same day. I'm keen to understand that exchange of email. I don't just want the route map, I want the exchange of correspondence that underpins it. And it would be very helpful.
I haven't seen those documentations, so I'm not aware of them, but if we can share them with you and there aren't any constraints around them, I don't see why we wouldn't.
Excellent, I look forward to that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on points previously explored by colleagues. You said, Permanent Secretary, that it was important to test procedures with staff who are likely to rely on a procedure. You've suggested that earlier this morning. I just want to understand if the same emphasis was placed on hearing from staff who actually had experience of reporting a complaint or concern under the existing procedure.
So I'm trying to think carefully about what would be helpful to you here. I think we had information already, though HR would be able to confirm for me. We would know that people who had used the Fairness at Work procedure, which has been extant since 2010, we would know in HR how that had operated, how well that would operated. And that was one of the reasons why we knew we needed to make some take some reflection on how it might need to be revised. That would also include, my understanding would be, people who had used that and worked closely with HR in using Fairness at Work. So our knowledge of previous procedures and whether they were working or not was very much based on how well they had operated, how they'd felt as part of the people who had been engaged in them, and we would have used that information as part of our understanding of what needed to be addressed. Clearly, one of the things that we were wanting to try and do at a time between October and December 2017, when people were coming forward with concerns, was to be as clear as possible, particularly about what might have happened or what might have helped with them in the past that we could now include in a subsequent procedure. So would some of the things that we were thinking about as we developed the 2017 procedure have enabled some things to have been stopped short, to have been prevented, to have been in some way reduced in some being. So we're always looking to say if we can try and prevent any informal procedure being required, let alone a formal one. And that was part of our conversations with people at that time.
On that informal approach to dealing with concerns, what's your view? You know, do you regard moving individuals who raise concerns as the solution to a problem, or do you think it would be more helpful to step back and address the broader problem? I mean, if moving people becomes habitual, is there enough oversight that someone would realise that there was a requirement to step back and actually find out why these moves were required in the first place?
So it will, I think, as I mentioned earlier on, it will always be preferable and important and part of our responsibility in terms of duty of care to get to the root of the issue. Merely moving somebody in the circumstances which I think you're kind of alluding to is not going to do that. And that's been something I've been very clear about in my time as Permanent Secretary. We need to get to prevent wherever possible. But if these issues do happen, merely moving people in itself does not get to the root of the issue. And that's one of the reasons why, as I mentioned earlier on, we're very keen to ensure that we offer and explore all options of mediation, support from HR, line management support, and so on, to ensure if we can ensure that these issues are, if not prevented, at least spotted. And we are now training our line managers to spot the signs of these kinds of concerns, but wherever possible, prevented. It's another reason why we've strengthened the line management and the seniority of the line management in supporting our private offices. Actually, one of the things that I've introduced is that we have somebody who is overseeing within a pastoral care mode private offices, which are often a place of great stress and great, very heavy, long hours and so on. And that we're also making sure that we have the opportunity for people to raise concerns as part of our regular HR regime. So every single person in the Scottish Government should have a monthly conversation with their line manager. That's something that was introduced just before I became Permanent Secretary, actually by the previous Permanent Secretary. But it's something that I have tried to embed. And that is not just about business and how the organisation is operating and how effectively that individual is operating within their team and as an individual. It's also about well-being. And there is a template which we encourage people to use, which enables people not just to raise the business of the day, which will always be the temptation, but also issues that are of concern to them at work or indeed at home and in their relationships with the people they're working with. So there's some very specific, and I can give you a lot of other examples as well, but there's some very specific parts of what we are trying to do to ensure that people feel comfortable and confident in their working environment.
There are obviously situations in which you know, despite the best efforts to prevent a situation arising or, you know, to try to deal with it informally, it becomes subject of a complaint. And the trade unions last week raised concerns about the risk that the lack of an independent process continues to raise. I'm aware of the ongoing review, but surely you would agree that it would be surprising if independence is not insisted upon in any future iteration of a policy.
I think it will be a point that will be raised, as it was, as I said earlier on, with the Westminster procedure. I think as I said, we need to be careful in thinking about independence as to when and how it manifests itself. I think I absolutely agree that the relationship between civil servants and ministers, as I've said earlier on, is unique, and there is a power base to that, of course, as well. But I think I would want to be thoughtful about how and where independence was introduced so that it added value and added a benefit and addressed the issues that you've raised without becoming a burden, or indeed, and the thing we need to think about very carefully is that this doesn't deter people from still being prepared to use a procedure. It becomes so Byzantine, so complex, so unyielding that people feel put off in bringing a complaint into the formal procedure if they wish to. So I think there is a balance to be struck here. Nevertheless, I'm looking forward to the results of the Laura Dunlop review, which may well include independence as part of it.
No further questions, Convener. Thank you.
Margaret Mitchell.
Good morning, Permanent Secretary. In your previous evidence on the 18th of August, you stated that in developing the 2017 policy, we took evidence from Police Scotland. Could you confirm who we refers to?
That would be HR.
HR. Could you confirm who from Police Scotland was contacted with the request that they should give advice? And did the same person actually give advice?
I can't give you that information, but I'm sure we should be able to look into that and provide it.
So that wasn't something that interested you and you sought to find out a little bit more about?
The development of the procedure, contact with ACAS, contact with Police Scotland and so on, was very much within the remit of the project led by James Hind and supported by and helped by HR under Nicky Richards. So it wouldn't have been something that I would have been involved in.
But you were very interested in the content of that advice, because you've been able to tell us today that it was to be victim-led, with the individuals who were bringing the concerns or complaint very much to the fore, and that there should be confidentiality. Anything else that you were aware of in that advice?
I just have to reiterate, I was not involved in the seeking of that advice, nor would I be. That it's not my role to ring up Police Scotland and ask them if they would contribute to a policy. HR would have done that, and I'm subsequently aware that those were the areas that that Police Scotland contributed to because of their experience in this area. So it was quite right and proper for HR to have those conversations with Police Scotland in this context, but it wouldn't have been something that I would have been involved in.
Not involved in, but very much aware of the advice. I think you've
Well, I am
said
now,
that.
yes.
Okay. In 2017, the policy then did go on to allow or to provide through the route map that the Scottish Government could bring complaints directly to the attention of the police. And on the 18th of August, you told the committee that the Scottish Government decided to refer 3 complaints to Police Scotland. Who took that decision?
So I think when we said 3 complaints, it was 3 incidences. That's correct. We're now getting into, I think, the investigative element of our discussions around the committee, but it would be the Scottish Government that took that decision based on legal advice.
The Scottish Government isn't a person. People represent the Scottish Government. It might have been you representing ministers. It may have been another person. Who was the person that took the decision, or the group of people?
I represent the Scottish Government, so ultimately all decisions that are taken by officials come through me, of course, or come through me, but are represented by me. And it was based on, towards the end of the investigative period, legal advice that we should refer this to Police Scotland.
And in that case, did you inform the police, or did someone else?
No, I did not.
Do you know who did inform the police?
I'm not completely aware of who that might be. We could probably find out, though I suspect it may well be, well, I wouldn't want to name them, of course, but I'm sure we could find out who took
Have you got a
that.
designation of a person you might
I
be
suspect what will have happened, but I don't know this for sure, is that what would expect to be happened is all the information would have been passed over to the Crown Office. I don't know who did that, but I can find out if that is necessary.
Can I refer you to document YY064, 10th of November 2017, a letter from you to Gillian Russell, in which you make some comment about briefing her and working with her. This was from Judith McKinnon to brief and work with her to arrange for legal advice around the limits of confidentiality process, note-taking, and when you would pass on information to the police and police directorate. So it seems from that you had a very clear idea that it would possibly be Gillian Russell. Can you remember if that was the case?
No, I think we're confusing and conflating 2 things here. There was a decision, as you rightly asked me about, in regard to the Scottish Government referring 3 specific instances to the police at the end of the investigative period, the investigation, and after my decision report. The period that you're talking about is to do with the role of Gillian Russell. Sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned her name, but the role of the individual who was acting as the confidant and sounding board at this time, which included making sure that all parties that might come to her with concerns were clear about their options and where they might go. And that might include them going to the police, and that is included within the procedure. Individuals are able to go to the police at any time with any concerns that they feel it is appropriate to do so. They don't need to do that through the Scottish Government.
So you've confirmed you took the decision that these complaints should be referred to the police. Was the First Minister informed of this decision?
I'm not sure. She will have been, but I'm pausing because I'm not sure what the procedure was, but she will have been informed of that, yes.
Did you inform her?
I don't remember informing her. This is 3 years ago. It may well have been me. It may well have been the Lord Advocate, but it could have been a number
Could you
of people who were
perhaps
involved.
check and come back to the committee?
I can
on
check
that
and see if
point?
we can
That
find
would be
out,
very
yeah.
helpful. And do you know who the Scottish Mum obviously referred these complaints? Do you know what date they were referred to? No, you don't know that.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. And in taking do you know who in Police Scotland was in charge of the investigation?
No, I can't tell you that. I don't know.
As head of the civil service, who would you expect to contact about something?
We would not get
As
into that
serious
level
as
of
this?
detail with Police Scotland. That's an operational matter. That's not something that I would expect to be involved in. Our role and responsibility would be to pass any information that we had, and we did, over to the Crown Office at that point.
So nothing would go directly to the police?
I can't tell you about the detail of what was sent and what wasn't sent to the police at the moment. I don't have that detail.
Could you explain the process? I'm struggling to understand here. You've decided that a complaint will go to the police.
Yes.
Then what happens? Does someone contact the police or does it go straight to the Procurator Fiscal? I would have thought there would have to be an investigation by the police, and on the basis of that, that information would be passed to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal, and sufficiency of evidence would be looked at.
So I can't give you chapter and verse of the procedure and who did that at the time, but I'm happy to go back and write to you about what information we have about which individual took which phone call and which reference at which point. This, to me, to my mind, comes very clearly into the role of the investigation, actually, and is very closely associated with that. So it may well be, if you're very interested in that element, that we can include that in the information that we're going to be submitting to the committee on the investigation in due course.
I think it also comes into the operational responsibility. The responsibility, if you have the responsibility to contact the police, I think there should be some indication of who you would go. Obviously, I wouldn't expect you to lift the phone up or the individual.
No, indeed.
And speak to the desk sergeant. So it would be very helpful in just looking at the operational responsibility and how the policy played out, if you could come back with that information.
Will do.
Thank you.
Okay. Maureen Watt.
Just a very small point. If you're not the line manager of James Hind and Nicky Richards, who is?
So there are Directors General that reports to me, and James reports to a Director who reports to a Director General, and Nicky reports to a Director General.
Okay.
And both those Directors General report to me.
Right, okay.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of wee quick questions coming on from what committee members have raised today. I'm interested in the point that the Deputy Convener was raising, and thank you for the offer to send information that will also inform the next part of our inquiry. I'm interested in at what point the government would take legal advice during an investigation. Would it be if there was an alarm bell that was rung that made you think, oh gosh, this might be quite serious? Would you take legal advice at that point? Or would it be at the end of the investigation, perhaps after confirmation that a claimant wished to go further? Would it be at that point you would take legal advice?
So legal advice in terms of internal legal advice, we keep in touch with our legal colleagues quite regularly through a procedure of that kind anyway, just to ensure HR colleagues would, I'm sure, speak to legal colleagues on a not frequent but regular basis as that process continued, just to make sure that they were keeping in lines and keeping to the heart of the procedure legally.
Thank you. On an unrelated point, thinking about the many iterations of the policy as it went through normal procedure, the process by which it was decided how complaints about former ministers would be dealt with by whoever was the current First Minister. Can you take me through how that decision was made and what changes there were to how it would end up in the final document?
So the iterations of those documents, of the final procedure, continued to refine and define what it was that was going into that. But from the very beginning, from the very onset, there was, due to, as I've said earlier on, the analysis and the work that had been undertaken on the fairness at work and some of the gaps that had been identified as part of that process. So the issue about former ministers was already inherent in the work that we'd undertaken and therefore was quickly represented in the early iterations of those documents. There would continue to be an iterative process of James Hind, as I'm sure he shared with you, legal colleagues and HR colleagues about the practicalities of ensuring that a procedure was applicable. So one of the things that we're very aware of is a procedure that might look fine on paper, but needs to also take into account issues of when the ministerial code comes in, issues of when people should be alerted and so on. So that iterative process would have been live throughout all of those versions of the document. But the very early stage already included the issue of past ministers. So I think you've had copies of the iterative document. We can give further information about why some changes were made at some point, I'm sure, if you're particularly interested in a particular version of when things were introduced. But that's the broad brush approach to the development of the procedure.
I'm interested in the specific of I don't have it in front of me, but I do remember, I think in the final version, where it discusses how it should be dealt with if the former minister is the same party as the current First Minister. So I'm interested in the development of that particular aspect of the policy and where it ended up.
Come back to you on that. I wasn't involved in it, but I'm sure that James or Nikki would be able to give further information on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And can I thank the Permanent Secretary for her evidence. Thank you very much for coming back. And I note there's quite a few things that have come out of today that we will get something back in writing from you. And we will now have a comfort break, which will also allow for the changeover of witnesses. Thank you. session on phase the inquiry, which is the judicial review. The committee is not beginning its detailed scrutiny of the judicial review until later in the inquiry, but the committee agreed there was a need to hold this exploratory session with the government. I have to say, due to frustration at the lack of information being shared with the committee by the government on this issue. The committee has been informed by the Permanent Secretary and the Deputy First Minister that receiving a limited amount of documentation does not prevent a full account being provided in oral evidence. And as such, the committee agreed to invite key representatives from the government to come to committee to receive this level of detail. I therefore welcome the Lord Advocate, the Right Honourable James Wolfe QC, and welcome back Permanent Secretary Leslie Evans. Can I begin by inviting the Lord Advocate to take the solemn affirmation? If you would raise your right hand, please. Lord Advocate, repeat after me. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Indeed. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. I should have realised that you would know these lines very well. Can I invite our witnesses, please, to make very short opening statements, starting with Lord Advocate.
Yes. Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to make a short opening statement. The petitioner in this judicial review challenged the lawfulness of the government's harassment policy and its application in his case on a number of grounds. For the reasons set out in the government's statement to the committee, the government accepted that one of those grounds of challenge was well-founded and conceded the case. The government has already publicly expressed its regret that its investigation in this case was flawed, and on behalf of the government, I reiterate that apology. In its dealings with Parliament, the government operates within a constitutional and legal framework, which includes the principle of collective responsibility, the principle that generally ministers and not officials are accountable for the actions of government, the Law Officer Convention, and legal professional privilege. None of these principles will prevent the government from giving the committee a full account of its decision-making and legal position in relation to the judicial review. The government has made clear its commitment to cooperating as fully as possible with the committee's inquiry. The government will provide the committee with a further written document providing more detailed information about the judicial review. The government is currently looking again at what steps it can take with a view to enabling the committee to have access, so far as possible, to relevant court documents. As for the government's legal position, ministers are available, and indeed I am available, to answer questions from the committee about the government's legal position as required. All governments from time to time lose high-profile cases. It is a vindication of basic principles of constitutional democracy that the government's actions can be tested in court and that the government accepts the outcome. If there are lessons to be learned from what happened, those lessons should be learned, and the government will learn any lessons which arise from this particular case. I look forward to assisting the committee's inquiry.
Thank you very much. Ms Evans.
Given today's exploratory session is on the judicial review, let me say at the outset the Scottish Government conceded that one part of the internal procedure should have been applied differently, and I repeat my unreserved apology to all concerned for this procedural failure and my commitment that we shall apply learning, including from the forthcoming review led by Laura Dunlop QC. Convener, an apology is important, but so is an explanation. Whilst the meaning of the procedure's paragraph 10 about the role of the investigating officer was clear to those involved in its drafting, its development and its operation, that is, the investigating officer not being involved in the matter being investigated, in the context of the judicial review, it became clear that the paragraph was open to a different interpretation. That is, to mean no involvement in the subject matter of the complaint and, in addition, no prior contact with the complainers themselves. During the judicial review, it became evident that removing the scope for any different interpretation would have been beneficial. The test of bias in the judicial review is whether, and I quote, the fair-minded and informed observer, having considered the facts, would conclude that there was a real possibility that the person judging the issue was biased. In December 2018, following legal advice, the Scottish Government concluded that interactions between the investigating officer and complainers were such that the test of apparent bias was met. Once clear, the decision to concede the judicial review was taken quickly. However, and importantly, the basis for the Scottish Government concession of the judicial review was the acceptance of apparent bias, not actual bias. The Scottish Government did not and does not accept any suggestion that the investigating officer acted in a partial way, or that either the investigation or the decisions that were reached were partial. At all times, those involved in the procedure acted in good faith.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary. And we'll move direct to questions from the committee now. Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Lord Advocate. My first questions are to you. In your submission, you state, I can also confirm on behalf of the government that there was no decision to withhold documents relevant to the judicial review. Nonetheless, relevant documents were only provided by the Scottish Government as a result of commission and diligence having been lodged. Why?
I think the first thing I should make clear is to reiterate there was no decision, as I've set out in my written statement, to withhold documents from the judicial review. Indeed, the government introduced into the judicial review proceedings the factual contact that the investigating officer, the fact that the investigating officer had contact with the complainers at an early stage. There was a process of the production of documents that proceeded voluntarily. At a certain point, a court order was made, as court orders may be made in order to provide for the process of a commission to take place. In my own professional experience, it's not unusual for the process of commission and diligence, which involves a detailed, in effect, line-by-line, point-by-point examination of individuals who have access to documents, to ask them about the searches they've undertaken, about the places where they may have documents. It's not unusual for that process to produce additional material. It would clearly have been much more satisfactory if that material had been available at a much earlier stage. And no doubt in due course, a matter the committee may want to investigate further maybe the searches that were undertaken and how that late identification of additional documentation came about. It's the fact of what happened. The voluntary disclosure of documents and in due course further disclosure of documents, a fuller picture of the interactions between the investigating officer and the complainers than had previously been available, a reassessment of the government's position in the judicial review, and a decision to concede. And I may say that decisions to concede litigation reflect a responsible attitude to dealing with issues that arise in the conduct of litigation. As I say, there may be more questions to be asked about the detail of the investigation and search for documents, but that's the fact of what happened.
The Scottish Government statement on 20th July confirms that these documents included a text and calendar entries. Why were these documents so relevant? Could you expand on that?
Yes, I mean, it's fair to say I've come briefed on, to deal with this as an exploratory session, looking at the, in particular, at the further material that the government may be able to provide. And as I've already said in my opening statement, the government will provide a more detailed account of what happened in the course of this judicial review. In particular, it's recognised that in the chronology that was produced yesterday, that the committee should be given more information about the period September 2018 to January 2019 and the whole process of disclosure of documents, recognising the very fact the members' interest bespeaks an understandable interest on the part of the committee in that. So the committee can expect more information about that process, and in due course that will provide an opportunity for the committee to ask pointed questions of myself and others, no doubt, about why particular pieces of information resulted in a particular conclusion being drawn.
And would you be aware about how specifically the documents, including the text and calendar entries, were recovered through the commission process? Did they have to go to a specific person to recover these documents?
I think there are perhaps two separate questions, if I may, within that question. The first is in terms of who was undertaking searches and which individuals were undertaking searches. And then there's a separate question about the detail of what happened at the commission hearings themselves. I'm afraid I'm not today cited on those matters, and it would be fair to say that in the terms of what precisely who was undertaking searches and how those were being done, I suspect those would be questions better addressed to others. I should say I'm not trying to resist those. As I've already said, the government will make more information available, and that will, I anticipate, facilitate questioning of the detail, the sort that the member is pursuing.
Perhaps then I could ask you, Ms Evans, that who had overall responsibility for the management of the judicial review, and how was this responsibility managed?
So the judicial review process, which kicked off from end of August and concluded in January, had two components to it. It was the legal advice, of course, under the SGLD, who are our legal team, and they were the people who were informing and advising the government about, or other parts of government about the process, how the procedure would work, and also acting to the client, if you like, in terms of the legal aspects of the case. My office was the coordinating point for much of that work, but it was drawing also on HR, of course on legal advice and on other parts of the organisation as appropriate. And particularly, I think, in relation to the issue of how information was produced, there were some very specific procedures which we operate in these circumstances about searches, about word searches and so on. And as Lord Advocate has suggested, there is information we can share, I'm sure, about that, about how the procedure works.
I wonder, are you able to say if the government was already aware of the documents that were recovered through commission and diligence, but didn't produce them because they didn't think they were relevant? And I've only one more question after this, convener.
So we were asked at frequent intervals, actually, but particularly at the beginning, to do searches for particular documentation and with particular, normally when a search procedure is carried out, it's to do with keywords that are entered into the system, as you might imagine. Once we had the Evidence Commission established on the 14th of December, we were asked to revisit that with additional granularity. So particularly, I think you mentioned texts and calendar entries were particularly asked for as part of that process. So some information which had not been previously asked for in terms of its granularity was revisited with a wider set of search criteria at that point. I think it's worth pointing out that I think we had 2 working days and a weekend to turn around that, which is pretty intense. And also we're talking about email traffic each week in the Scottish Government of 2.7 million items and something like 30 million items which are in our electronic management system at any time.
Points well made. Finally, who took the key strategic decisions around the Scottish Government's response to the judicial review? You, Permanent Secretary, or the First Minister?
So I was cited and therefore the decision maker in the procedure that was under scrutiny. So it was always going to be me that was going to be responsible for ensuring that we responded to the JR. But of course, ministers were also co-cited, they were co-respondents. So at key points during the process, based on legal advice from our legal colleagues from council, indeed from Lord Advocate, there were regular reviews about prospects of success and so on. And there were key points, those were obviously shared with both myself and the First Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alison Johnson, please, and then Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. If I may explore in the first instance with the Lord Advocate. Is it your view, I mean, do you regard the Scottish Government's position with regard to the information that we've been able to see so far with regard to this issue as being in line with the principle of open and transparent government?
Well, the government's provided the committee with a statement and relevant documentation. I've advised the committee this morning that the government intends to provide a more detailed account of what happened in the judicial review, recognising that committee's interest, and it was reflected in the questions from Margaret Mitchell, in a degree of granular information about what happened in the course of the judicial review. And the government is also actively exploring what further steps it can take proactively to enable the committee to have access, so far as possible, to relevant court documents. And on the assumption that all of that is made is available to the committee, that will enable the committee to get a much more granular and detailed understanding of what happened in the course of this particular litigation.
The legal authority that supports the Scottish Government's blanket statement that documents which form part of the court process or have been lodged with the court are the property of the court and can't be released without the court's permission?
I think perhaps I can answer that question this way. The annex to the committee's letter of the 11th of August 2020 identifies a range of documents which the committee seeks in connection with the court process. The question of access to that quite wide range of documents is not straightforward. Different considerations apply to different types of documents, and of course that's overlaid by the particular restrictions which apply in this case, of which the committee is well aware. And of course the committee will appreciate that the interests of other parties as well as of the court itself are engaged. And that's why the government is actively looking, and I can confirm that what the Deputy First Minister advised the committee yesterday, that the government is actively looking at what steps it can take proactively to ensure that as far as possible those documents are made available to the committee. And whilst I can't guarantee what the outcome of that will be, I will be disappointed if that doesn't result in the committee being able to see, have access to relevant court documents as far as possible.
No, that's warmly welcomed because, you know, we want to be in a position of understanding, you know, documents which may have importance to the context of our inquiry that are currently, you know, we have been unable to benefit from at the moment. Can I just ask finally on the issue of the independence of the investigator or otherwise in the development of the process? I mean, you know, colleagues have already raised the fact, the issue this morning that complainers had been made aware that Judith McKinnon would be the investigating officer. We've also heard comments from the Permanent Secretary about the ideal time to introduce that independence, that perhaps it may seem off-putting to some, it may be seen as an escalation or making something that could be dealt with informally a bigger matter than it might otherwise be. But here we have the impact of that apparent or actual lack of independence. Was that a concern to yourself as this process was going forward? I mean, I hope at some point the committee will be in a better position to understand why it took so long for this issue to become the issue that it did indeed become.
I absolutely understand the point about timing, and you know, that I can say is well understood. And the committee will understand. I'm not going to talk about when or to what extent I was or wasn't involved personally for reasons that have been explained to the committee. What I can say is that in terms of the government's legal position, the government, I think as the Permanent Secretary has already said, interpreted its policy in a particular way in terms of the absence of previous involvement of the investigating officer in the matters being investigated. In the course of the judicial review, inevitably in any litigation against government, the government's legal position comes under scrutiny and has to be looked at again, and it was recognised that there was an alternative interpretation and that there was an issue of interpretation of the policy. The government was content that that issue of interpretation could and should be put before the court for a decision, and there are often advantages in getting the clarity of a court decision. That was a decision taken at a particular stage in the process. As the government statement has made clear, the identification of further documents and what that disclosed about the interactions between the investigating officer and the complainers led to a review of the government's position in light of the additional common law requirements in relation to the appearance of fairness. As the Permanent Secretary has told the committee, a conclusion reached that in light of the fuller picture then available of those interactions, that common law test was met and that the action should be conceded.
Just one further question, Convener. At what point was the government aware that the petition was being contested on particular grounds?
Well, the petition, of course, raised a number of grounds of challenge, both to the lawfulness of the policy itself and also to the way it had been applied in this case. I would hope that the government will be able to give the committee more detail of that. The government decided to contest the petition, to resist the petition on the grounds on which it was brought. At a later stage in the process, and this is part of the further information that I expect the government to make available to the committee, at a later stage in the process, the government adjusted its pleadings to, in a way that, among other things, disclosed the interaction between the investigating officer and the complainers. It was the government that put that into the domain of the litigation. The petitioner then revised his petition to add the grounds challenging the application of the procedure because of that interaction, and that then, through the course of the production of documents looking at that particular issue, led ultimately to the concession.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, can I ask you, Lord Advocate, before I go on to Murdo Fraser, that's to two of our committee, you've said that we would get further information. So can you tell me, has that a decision that's now been made? And can you tell me when we can expect that further information?
Yes, I mean, it's a decision that's been made, and I think it's referred to in the Deputy First Minister's letter to the committee yesterday about a more detailed chronology. As with previous requests to the Permanent Secretary, I'm afraid I can't give the committee a date, but I can say it's understood that the committee is taking an interest in in the detail of the judicial review process. I suspect that the completion of that work may well have to be aligned with the steps being taken to see, with a view to enabling the committee to have access to the court documents, because the convener, you'll appreciate that an accurate understanding of the scope and at the same time any limits on the ability to provide access to those court documents is something the government will have to make sure it accurately reflects through in the information it provides.
To accurately reflect what we're hearing then, are you saying that the additional information you're talking about is the chronology that was referred to in the First Minister's letter and not anything further?
Well, it may take the form of a chronology, or it can take the form of a written statement, but additional information about as it were, the progress of the judicial review, I anticipate will be made available to the committee, both through steps being proactively taken to enable the committee to have access to court documents. I obviously can't, I can't today guarantee what the outcome of that will be, but we'll be disappointed if that doesn't bear fruit, and also through the government itself providing additional information, responding to the questions the committee is asking.
Right, but the Deputy First Minister's letter talking about the chronology, but you then said, I think in response to Alison, about information that we would be likely to get at a later stage in the process? So
I think the key point, convener, if I may, is that the government will provide additional information about the process of the judicial review in a much more fine-grained way than it has in its original, its initial statement, responding to questions such as the questions that Margaret Mitchell was asking earlier.
I don't know if the Permanent Secretary would like to respond to my particular questions in relation to deadlines that were set, information that was requested and hasn't arrived. And I'm sure there's other members of the committee who would like to pursue some of this further. Permanent Secretary.
So I think we're now firmly in the, it feels to me like there are two elements here. We have complied with deadlines so far. I know there's been question marks whether that's been the case, but I can reassure you that we've complied with all three at the moment. The fourth is to do with, which is information I know you're awaiting, which is to do with information due to come out on the investigation. And that is connected to the work that is underway already, as the Lord Advocate has mentioned, to ensure that we can share as much as possible with you. There is a connection as part of that information on investigation, which has an element of the request that the Lord Advocate has made reference to in terms of the court and undertakings that have been given to the court. So I think the issue from our point of view is to give you, as the Lord Advocate said, as much information as possible at the same time as possible. But that has a connection to some of the dealings with the court that the Lord Advocate referenced. So whilst, yeah, I don't think I can add anything further to that.
Okay, thank you for that. As I say, I'm sure there are other committee members who would like to probe this a little further. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if I can pursue with the Lord Advocate initially issues around the legal position of the Scottish Government. And I appreciate we haven't seen the legal advice, and that's a matter of ongoing discussion between the committee and the Government. But the Deputy First Minister and yourself have said in correspondence to the committee that you'll be happy to give a full account of the legal position at different points in time in relation to areas of interest to the committee. So in that vein, I wonder if I can maybe start at the end of the process and work back and look, first of all, at the issue of the expenses that were paid to Mr Salmon, which totalled £512,250. And as you'll be aware, Lord Advocate, in a litigation, it is usually the case under normal circumstances where expenses are awarded on a party-and-party scale. In this case, they were awarded on the much higher scale of agent and client-paying scale. And you've said in your written submission, the rules on the recovery of expenses in litigation provide for payment of an additional fee in certain specified circumstances, and in this case, the Scottish Government accepted that an additional fee was justified on a number of heads. Now, according to advice from Lord Hodge, who you'll be familiar with, these additional expenses would be paid, in his words, where one of the parties has conducted the litigation incompetently or unreasonably and thereby caused the other party unnecessary expense. So was your defence incompetent or unreasonable, or both?
I think there are two separate issues in the question. One is the question of the additional fee element, and the other is the question of the agent and client paying. And I think the quotation that you've given is related to the agent and client paying element. That was a reflection of the way in which the disclosure of documents emerged in the course of the litigation, and the unsatisfactory circumstance that very late in the day the government conceded the case on the basis of information which by that time had come to light, but in a context where it had taken some time for documents to be produced. So it's a reflection of the course of the litigation, and a reflection of the expectation, legitimate expectation, that so far as possible, government will have identified the relevant material at an early stage. That didn't happen in this case, and the consequence followed. As far as the additional fee element is concerned, there are various factors that are taken into account in the rules of court. The complexity of the case, the skill, time and labour and specialised knowledge required of the solicitor, the number or importance of documents prepared, the importance of the cause or the subject matter of it to the client, and so on. A number of heads under the rules of court which fall to be considered in deciding whether or not an additional fee may or may not be payable. In this case, it was clear that a number of those heads were satisfied, and that it was entirely right that an additional fee be paid.
You've accepted, if I heard you rightly, that the Scottish Government's handling of this was unsatisfactory. But does that amount to incompetence or unreasonableness?
Well, I'm not going to use any particular adjective, but certainly as the government's senior law officer, I would like to see circumstances don't life is, the world is not perfect. Things don't go as as one would like to see them. One would always like to see the government able to take the right decisions at the right time, at the earliest possible point in a context of a litigation, in this case for reasons that the committee will, I'm sure, be interested in exploring. The decision wasn't made until a late point in the case. These things happen in litigation. Litigation is not a scientific exercise. I've already made the point that, in my own professional experience, it's not unusual for a commission process to result in the identification and production of material that, in perfectly good faith, witnesses didn't previously identify, and for that to cast a different light on a litigant's position. But the important thing is that litigants, whether they're public authorities or not, address the issues on their merits as and when they arise.
Okay. The petition was served on the Scottish Government on the 31st of August 2018. I imagine at that point legal advice was taken internally from yourself or from your colleagues who are law officers. At that point, what was the consideration of the strength of the Scottish Government's position in relation to defending the petition?
I think At that point, the issue upon which the government ultimately conceded wasn't part of the case. I think that's perhaps an important point to make. The government was entirely, at that stage, satisfied that it was right to contest the petition on all the grounds that were being advanced at that time. And indeed, the concession ultimately made didn't relate to any of those grounds.
Is it correct that the government took Council's opinion from a senior QC in September 2018, that advised that the case was not a strong one?
Was
that the Scottish Government did not have a good case to defend?
As the committee is well aware, the government doesn't disclose either the content or the source of its legal advice.
Well, just to remind you, Lord Advocate, you did write to us to say you would be happy to give us a full account of your legal position at different points in time. I do think it's a relevant question whether you'd taken Council's opinion that guided your defence.
There's a really important difference between the government's position at any particular point in time and the process by which that position is arrived at. I mean, it's the normal process of government decision-making is that policymakers, decision-makers take legal advice, they seek advice, they assess that. There may be competing points of view being advanced. Government assesses the position and reaches a view as to the legal position that it's prepared to defend. And ultimately, the government is accountable for that position, first of all, in court. And that's quite important that in this context, the government was considering the position and deciding what position it was prepared to stand up and defend in court. And, of course, ultimately accountable to parliamentarians and others for the legal position that it adopts. It's a principle, and it may be that we can touch on that further, that the government will be entirely accountable and is always accountable for the legal position that it takes and for the legal considerations that underpin a policy decision. The question of from whom and what the content of any particular piece of legal advice in the context of reaching that position is not disclosed.
Okay, so if we move on then to the period 19th to 21st of December, when the Commission was being heard, it was at that point that there was a light bulb moment, if I can call it that, and the Scottish Government realised that this case was no longer defensible. I suppose what was behind that change of opinion, and why was this flaw in the defence not spotted sooner?
Well, I think there are, the committee will appreciate that the legal conclusion, the legal judgment, depends on the facts and the factual circumstances to which that judgment and conclusion is being applied. The committee's already heard and is aware that documentation came to light in the course of the commission process that led to a reassessment of the government's position.
The Scottish Government already had.
Oh, I don't for a moment question the interest the committee will have in looking at the process of disclosure of documents. As I said earlier, litigation is, litigation is a high-pressure process. It's not a perfect process. There was disclosure of documents. There were further searches in due course. Particular documents came to light that had not previously been identified, which gave a fuller picture of the interaction between the investigating officer and the complainers, and that led to the conclusion to concede the litigation.
Okay. And that failure to spot that fuller picture cost the taxpayer £512,000.
Well, I suppose there may be a question about at what point it would have been reasonable to identify that, and what level of expense had been incurred before that, and what level of expense was incurred afterwards. I mean, I don't think I can assist. I can't really assist any further on that question.
Okay, one more question, if I can, Convener, to the Permanent Secretary, if I may. It was reported that after the conclusion of the judicial review case, you sent a text message to a colleague that contained the words, "We may have lost the battle, but we will win the war." Can I ask you what you meant by that?
Yes, I think that has been misinterpreted as having some kind of conspiratorial element to it. Can I clearly say that is not the case? I have been working since I was first appointed as Permanent Secretary on the 1st of July 2015 to make the organisation a more inclusive, diverse organisation that respected everybody's right to come to work and to have the right kind of conditions of work. That equality was at the heart of the business of government, but it was also heart of the organisational culture. So I was not referring to any individual when I sent that text. I was talking about a long-term commitment of mine and indeed of the Scottish Government, as you will see from its policy documents, to ensure that equality lies at the heart of what it does, but also how it operates as an organisation.
So you weren't at war with Alex Salmon?
No.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Angela Constance.
Thank you very much, Convener. I've got 2 or 3 questions for the Permanent Secretary before having some questions for the Lord Advocate, Convener. Permanent Secretary, just a couple of quick questions to begin with. The document that I'm referring to is the Scottish Government's written evidence to committee on its participation in the judicial review dated the 20th of July this year. And I just wondered if you could confirm for the record, there's a statement in paragraph 9 that says on the 22nd of August 2018, following the conclusion of the investigation, the Permanent Secretary notified the former First Minister of her decision. Is that accurate? You stand by that?
I think that's accurate if it was in the submission.
Okay, thank you. And in paragraph 20, there's a sentence that says the Permanent Secretary is the decision maker under the procedure at issue in the proceedings. Are you still content with that statement for the record?
I am the decision maker under the procedure.
Okay, thank you. And if I can move on to paragraph 27. So we know from this document, which I think is paragraph 40, that the Permanent Secretary concluded on the 2nd of January 2018 that the Scottish Government should concede the case. And in paragraph 27, it outlines the terms of the settlement that both parties agreed. And part of that agreement included, and this is the top of page 7, and I quote where it says, in terms of which the settlement of the case had been agreed, including that the decision under review was unlawful in that it was taken in circumstances which were procedurally unfair and tainted by apparent bias. How then, Permanent Secretary, does that fit with everything that this inquiry has heard to date about the development of the policy being lawful? How does that fit when you hear the terms procedurally unfair, when clearly the procedures developed by civil servants have clearly been found wanting?
So I think I've never said anything other than use the terms apparent bias when I've been talking about the settlement of the JR. And I think I said it in my opening statement that this is apparent bias, not actual bias. So I think it's important to get that on the record. And the only other thing I can say is that the procedure was developed, as you have heard over the past couple of 3 sessions, by civil servants, professionals in their area, but also taking into account at all stages legal advice. So the development of the procedure was not done in some vacuum. It was done through a professional process which took into account advice from a range of sources, but throughout also took legal advice into account. And I think, as you heard from the Lord Advocate, and I'm not the one to speak in these terms, but judicial processes are not a science, and there will be different views taken about the application of procedures, as was in this case.
And they're clearly not a science, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. Again, Permanent Secretary, we've repeatedly heard this split between apparent and actual bias. But is it not the case in terms of whether a policy is robust, fair or legal that perception of bias can be everything?
Clearly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Could I ask just a few general questions of the Lord Advocate to begin with, please? If you could just maybe set the scene as a non-legal person, that might be quite helpful. Is it the case that more often than not that legal opinion in general for the purposes of government, that they're perhaps more about shades of grey than black and white issues? And is it maybe not the norm, but would it be the case that on occasion that government either disputes or ignores legal advice?
I think perhaps before I answer those 2 questions, I'd just pick up on Ms. Constance's question to the Permanent Secretary. I think in the context of those questions, it's important to distinguish between the procedure and the way the procedure was applied in this case. The procedure itself, I suppose what went wrong in this case was a set of interactions that were reflected the understanding of individuals at the time of what the procedure meant, and there's a legitimate legal dispute about whether that's what it meant or what it didn't mean, but which on examination, once the full picture was available, was judged to meet the test for apparent bias, which overlays it, the appearance of fairness. And that was to do with the nature and extent of the interactions rather than something intrinsic to the procedure itself. And that's something that no doubt in due course the committee may wish to look at in more detail. On the members' questions directed to me, on the first point, the member is absolutely right that particularly in, well, I suppose the first thing to say that the legal work involved in government is vast and wide-ranging in extent. It covers everything from bills, current and future, subordinate legislation, policy making, legal issues that arise in the administration of policy, litigation, a vast range of legal issues which arise, and it's not unusual in the context of, it's fair to say, legal advice generally. This is not peculiar to government, but particularly in the context of government, that issues may not be, issues may not be definitive, and indeed there may be different legal views which can be legitimately taken and legitimately expressed about a particular issue. That's not at all unusual. So the member is absolutely right to refer to shades of grey in legal advice. So far as the second question is concerned, the Ministerial Code makes clear the expectation that ministers and policymakers so I thought I had a copy of the Ministerial Code with me, but there it is. Makes clear
Entry level, Lord Advocate, you know, if I'm getting my will drawn up,
Yes.
and, you know, in that conversation, I'm saying to my lawyer, I want, and I have a specific example of this, I said, I want X, Y, and Z, and he says, no, that's completely unnecessary, you don't want to do that because there's a risk. And I say, well, I hear what you're saying, but actually, in the context of my life, you know, I do want that, and I think that risk is less relevant. So, you know, does this happen in government circles also?
Well, I mean, it's a basic point, which comes from the example that the member's given, that legal advisors advise and clients, and in this case, policy makers and ministers decide. But it's inherent in government, and the point about the Ministerial Code is that the Ministerial Code makes clear the expectation that ministers and officials should ensure their decisions are informed by appropriate analysis of the legal considerations, and the legal implications of any course of action are considered at the earliest opportunity. And within government, there's a structure of which the law officers are part, which reflects the importance of legal considerations being fully taken into account in the development of policy. But ultimately, it's ministers and policymakers who make decisions and who stand up and account for it day and daily in Parliament, and they account routinely for the legal implications as well as for the policy decision, so far as the legal implications have informed that policy decision. So that's a routine part of government action.
End of the day, policymakers, permanent secretary, ministers, they don't have to accept every word of legal advice. Would that be the bottom line? They need to consider it.
Of course they need to consider it, and ultimately, as I say, decision makers decide and policymakers make decisions. But one of the features of government is the responsibilities which government lawyers have, and ultimately law officers have as the ministers with a particular responsibility in this area, to assist government to live up to its commitment to acting lawfully. Now, at the end of the day, the member's absolutely right. Ministers and policymakers make the decision. One of the jobs of the way of the system of government, with law officers at the head, is to make sure that at least the legal considerations are fully taken into account, fully bottomed out. Any shades of grey are recognised and legal implications considered. Does it always happen? According to that perfect model, it's a human system.
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately this comes down to, you know, some fine-making decisions around judgments. So how then does this committee, without seeing legal advice, know whether or not the government accepted that advice in all its detail or not? And how then do we hold to account Permanent Secretary and others on those finer judgments?
Because the committee will have information about the legal position that the government took at particular points of time. And that position can be tested. And indeed, the committee is already testing the decision made to defend the petition at the outset, by looking at the concession made at the end of the process and asking why was that concession not made at an earlier stage. And the government will have to explain to the committee why that concession wasn't made at an earlier stage. So government is accountable for, both in court and in Parliament, for the legal position that it adopts. And it can be accountable without disclosing, and I'll come back to this in just a moment, without disclosing who said what to whom and what internal process of consideration there was. And as there's a real importance to holding to that principle, because if one didn't hold to that principle, it would actually create a disincentive to ministers and policymakers, seeking legal advice, seeking to be informed fully about the legal implications, and that would ultimately undermine the structure that I mentioned a moment ago.
So the government was clearly always intent in contesting the case, but it didn't oppose the permission to proceed. Can you give us any indication of the government's considerations at that point in time?
In any judicial review, there are two questions. One is, first of all, a judicial review doesn't get off the ground unless the court gives it permission to proceed. By the nature of that decision, that the threshold for refusing permission is set at an appropriately low bar, so that appropriately arguable cases will go forward to a full hearing. And the government took the view that this petition met that bar in terms of arguability, that the court would be likely to grant permission, but was nevertheless content that the issues raised in the petition were ones that it should contest.
Accepting that there was some case that you were going to have to defend. We heard last week from trade unions about actually some of the difficulties when developing policy around the employment relationship between ministers and the Scottish Government, and they were talking about some of the difficulties, practical difficulties when people don't work for the government, or indeed they're a former minister. And I wonder if you can say anything about the legal basis for the procedure and considerations in the judicial review process on that particular issue, given the difficulties with employment relationships or lack of employment relationships.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Apologise to the member. Didn't quite. The particular issue.
So the trade unions last week discussed when you're proceeding with a policy or devising a policy, that it's if there is not a direct employment relationship between the accused, for want of a better word, and the government, that's quite a tricky area to be in. And I wondered whether, whilst the judicial review was being progressed, how these issues were considered.
Yes. I mentioned at the outset that the petition presented a challenge on a number of grounds to the policy itself and also to its application. And the government was content to defend the petition on all the grounds initially stated, and in particular all the grounds about challenging the legality of the policy itself. I'd have to remind myself whether the particular issue that the members raised was one of those grounds, but all the grounds looking at the as it were, the lawfulness of the policy itself, the government was content to defend.
No, the ground on which the government conceded, I will indeed, and the additional, and there's a promise of additional information. Will the additional information give committee any insight into what the original grounds that the government was being challenged on, bearing in mind there was a range of grounds?
Yes. Well, I've already said that the government's actively looking at how it can make the court papers available to the greatest extent possible. And you know,
Yep. And I just
I would hope that process will
okay,
reveal.
thank you. I have one very final question, Convener, with your indulgence for the Permanent Secretary, and it relates to paragraph 37 of the document, where it says the Deputy Director for People Advice had contact before her appointment as investigating officer with 2 members of staff who lodged concerns in advance of their decisions to make formal complaints. What was the context of that contact? Was it to do specifically with concerns, or was it a more general contact through day-to-day government business?
It was alongside a range of other people who had raised concerns, ensuring that these people knew what their options were, what the support was that was available, that they could go to the police, but that there was a procedure that they would be able to use as well.
Okay.
Can I make one short point just in response to Ms. Constance's point about taking legal advice? I suppose the 2 things I would say is it's very unusual in my experience as a civil servant not to take legal advice as a policymaker. It's an absolute ingredient, constant ingredient in the way that policy is developed. And if that were the case, it would be really clearly challenged on a number of levels as to why that legal advice was not being taken into account. Very, very unusual indeed.
I suppose this is visibility to us, Convener.
I understand that.
Yes. Alex, can I just say to everyone that that's an hour and we've only had 3 committee members being able to ask questions so far. I'm not making comment on anyone's verbosity. Alex Cole. Oh, I didn't mean to say your name straight after that phrase, Mr. Cole Hamilton. Alex Cole Hamilton.
If the shoe fits. Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel, particularly Lord Advocate, welcome. Can I just follow up very briefly on a line of questioning that Murdo Fraser took with you, Lord Advocate? And that is, obviously, you're observing the protocols that government don't talk about legal advice that you've received. However, I reckon that if no legal opinion existed that suggested that the government was on unsafe ground in defending the judicial review, then you could tell us that. So can you confirm that there was no legal opinion saying that?
The government doesn't disclose either the content or the source of its legal advice.
That's fine. Okay, if I can move to you, Permanent Secretary, just in terms of, again, following on from some of the questioning from Angela Constance at the very end there, in terms of the contact that existed, I'm keen to understand, after it became clear that Mr. Salmond intended to take the investigation to judicial review, the steps that you took to satisfy yourself that the government had acted properly and its position was defensible. So in that context, can I ask when you first learned about the contact between Judith McKinnon and the complainer?
I'm not pausing other than to think carefully about what I knew when. So I would have been aware that the investigating officer was having contact with people who were raising concerns.
Sorry, I should say prior to her being appointed as investigating
Yes, that's my point.
Yeah.
So I would be aware that Judith McKinnon, in her professional capacity, would have had contact with all those, or many of those, who had raised concerns, some of whom decided to take them into complaint, and that it was pretty generic of the kind that Ms. Constance. But I wouldn't have known who those people were, and I wouldn't have known the extent of that. That wouldn't have been appropriate as the decision maker in the procedure, as Ms. Constance pointed out, nor indeed in my general day-to-day level of detail of that kind.
Going through the procedure line by line, you would have recognised that improper contact between an investigating officer and a complainer prior to their appointment as investigating officer would have created an exposed flank for the government. So when the petition was lodged, did you interrogate all of the contact that had happened between Judith McKinnon and the complainer, or did you ask somebody else to interrogate that contact?
So I think we need to go back to what the Lord Advocate said, is that when the petition was set out for the JR, the investigating officer and the role of the investigating officer did not appear in that.
Okay, so I guess then, did you see every sort of written piece of correspondence in terms of the due diligence in preparing for the review, whilst that wasn't first and foremost, it wasn't part of the complaint at the time,
No, it wasn't.
that it might represent an exposed flank further down the line? You didn't sort of do that belt and braces approach?
I was aware that there was an information gathering process, of course, because my own information, access to emails and so on, was being part of that. So there was a procedure at that stage which was calling for information quite early on about how the procedure was implemented, who was involved, who the key players were, what their roles were, and so on. I would not have seen, I think it was hundreds of documents. So are you saying, did I look at every single document? No, I didn't. But I would have expected that to have been a procedure which should have been carried out by individuals by doing searches using key criteria, and that's what happened.
And were you aware that Nicola Richards and Judith McKinnon had met with complainers and had subsequently revealed to the complainer, the potential complainer, the existence of other complainers or possible complainers?
No, I don't think I was aware of that at the time.
Okay.
Can't recall being aware of it, put it that way.
When did you become aware of that?
That Judith had mentioned other complainers to others.
Prior to anybody lodging a formal complaint?
Don't remember that coming up at all during that time.
During that time.
But of course, it is not unusual to do that. So it's not that this is a particularly extraordinary occurrence. It's not unusual for people to be told that other complainants are coming forward in other procedures.
But in retrospect, and looking at that and those events, could that be seen as something of a fishing expedition?
No.
An effort to trigger complaints?
It's so important that we get this absolutely on the record. There was no fishing expedition. Okay. There were a number of people, 10 around, I have learnt, that were raising concerns about their treatment and their experience in the government at that time. Okay. 2 of those decided to take that quite legitimately into the procedure which was marked complaint, i.e. formalising it. This apparent confection that there was some kind of phishing exercise encouraging people to do this, that were somehow trying to be preyed upon in some way, goes against everything that is on the professional HR, the DNA of a professional HR person.
It's an offer, but we have to ask these questions.
Of course.
Moder Fraser referenced the light bulb moment, the point at which the government doesn't realise it was going to lose the case. And it was, I think it was, Lord Advocate, you said it was when certain information came to light. Did you feel that that information was hidden from you when you were preparing the government's case for the judicial review?
That would imply that it was being deliberately kept from me. So, no.
Okay.
I wasn't aware of it, but do I think it was being hidden from me? No.
Okay. And can I ask final question, if I may, convener? Has anybody in the Scottish Government been subject to disciplinary action as a result to their role in the flawed investigation that led to the judicial review?
Well, we don't talk about disciplinary action in public, as you know.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if I could begin firstly by asking just if you could clarify, Permanent Secretary, on one point that's been discussed about the Houses a little bit in committee, and that was just about the appointment of an independent party. I'm not going to name who they are. I think you'll know who I'm referring to, but in some of the discussion in the committee, it's been suggested that you recommended an independent party, whereas some of the correspondence we've had from James Hine suggests that you simply put forward names of people who could fill that role. Can you just, before we go any further, clarify that point, please?
Happy to. I think it's perhaps got a little confused. So I think the first thing to say is that James Hine didn't propose that an independent element should be introduced into the process. What he did do was he responded to my request to look at how independence might be included. He came back to that and suggested names of senior civil servants who would not be independent. They wouldn't have been external to the government. They wouldn't have been independent third parties. more importantly, or as importantly, it's possible that they might have actually been present at the time of these events taking place, which is a key part, as we know, of the investigating officer description and the role that somebody shouldn't have been party to the issues being under discussion. And more importantly, they wouldn't have the HR experience or indeed qualification that could be considered essential for this kind of complex and difficult issue that was likely to be considered as part of that procedure.
Thank you. On a different subject, really, but you raised yourself today the issue about who was whose line manager. But can you say a bit more about what the hierarchy was, if there was a hierarchy of people who on a day-to-day basis were dealing with all this stuff, who were dealing with the judicial review, and how that worked?
So there were a range of people involved in them, but for those of you who are not familiar with the, some would say, Byzantine hierarchy of the civil service, the main issues, and we're talking about senior civil servants here, is that people are at a deputy director level. So, for example, the investigating officer, Judith McKinnon's name has been mentioned already today, would be a deputy director. They report to a director, and such as Nikki Richards, who is head of HR. James Hind is a deputy director and would report to his director, and all directors report to director generals. So there's a large number of directors that report to directors general, and all of the directors general report to me. But I think the important thing to mention, and this perhaps is part of what you're interested in, is people who have a specialist responsibility, who have an area, particularly in the corporate centre of the organisation, if I can call it that, have a roving responsibility across the organisation, in that they are not they're not solely or uniquely focused on one policy area. They're working across all of government. So they might be talking to me about something one day, or talking to another director general at another stage. They're a corporate resource, if I can put it that way. And both the people that you've gained evidence from, James Hind and Nikki Richards, are indeed a corporate resource, and some of the most professional people I've worked with in my career as a civil servant.
Thank you. Lord Advocate, you mentioned at the beginning that the government, or all governments, deal with many cases which come before them in the form of judicial review. Is there anything about this case, which of course externally appears so extraordinary, that was handled differently from all those other many cases that you refer to, or was the process that was used in this case entirely the same?
The member's absolutely right that government routinely deals with a very significant volume of litigation. At any given time, there may be up to 100 or more cases that the government may be party to. At all levels of courts, and with a wide range of complexity and profile. Some of it is relatively routine, some of it is very high profile, some of it has real significance for policy, some of it for other reasons is very much in the public eye. Each litigation needs to be handled appropriately in a manner that reflects the particular circumstances of the case. In terms of the procedures that felt to be applied and the approach, there's nothing intrinsically out of the ordinary about this case. I mean, as the committee is well aware, it was very much in the public eye, its significance, in that sense, was not lost on those involved. But as a litigation, it had to be handled as other litigations are. Legal advice taken, considered, assessed. the government had to decide how to respond to the case. Decisions are then made in the course of the conduct of the litigation. Ultimately a review of the government's position, which led to a concession. These are processes which, while clearly it would have been significantly better if they'd been brought forward, are not peculiar to this case. From time to time, governments lose cases. From time to time, they concede cases, and it's proper that they should do so and they accept the outcome.
Thank you, Convener.
Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask what role, if any, special advisers had in relation to the judicial review, and whether the skills of special advisers may have been sought in relation to the judicial review?
None that I'm aware of.
Yes, I'm not sure I can really help with that question.
So are you both saying that, as far as you're aware, there weren't no special advisers were involved in any part of the judicial review?
I wouldn't see a natural role for. I'm not saying that there weren't conversations with special advisors. I couldn't possibly say that on oath, but I'm really not aware of it. No, it's not an obvious locus for a special advisor.
Lord Advocate.
Certainly speaking about the government's legal position, I can't really comment on that. I don't think I could say anything other than the Permanent Secretary has. On oath, I couldn't say to the committee that. I certainly don't recall any special advisor involvement to which I can speak.
And in terms of ministerial oversight then of the judicial review process, were there any government ministers that were regularly advised of the process of the judicial review, and what kind of discussions were had?
The First Minister was kept appraised of key points during the judicial review.
Okay, that's fine, thank you.
Jackie Bailey.
Good afternoon, Lord Advocate. I wonder, you've been saying that the government will explain to the committee why it didn't fold earlier at some kind of later point. But of course, you are the government. You are a minister as well as being the senior legal advisor. I'm wondering, why don't you tell us now?
Well, I rather thought I had. And it's in the government's statement that searches were being undertaken to produce relevant documentation. Additional documentation came to light that gave a fuller understanding of the interactions between the investigating officer and the complainers. The government reviewed its legal position, as it does from time to time in any case, and took the view that the right thing to do was to concede on the particular ground that it conceded on.
Okay. Can I take you back to an FOI that was published by the government that led us to understand there were 17 consultations with external counsel to discuss the judicial review. And I know, in response to my colleague Murdo Fraser, you can't tell us whether advice was given in September, but let's assume advice was given in September. Just so that I understand these things, was it the same counsel throughout? Did you chop and change counsel? Was the advice given consistent, or was it wildly different?
Throughout the judicial review, the same counsel were instructed for the Scottish Government. I can't speak to specifically to the number of meetings, nor, as the member recognises, can I say anything about the content of advice which may or may not have been tendered at different stages.
If it was the same counsel, it would be reasonable for me to assume that it was the same kind of legal advice then. There would be a consistency to it.
Well, I think there's a point that I've made, and I'm making this very much in the generality, that legal advice is tendered, that will be considered. I'm very much speaking the generality. I wouldn't want the committee to take anything in relation to this case, but ultimately there's a process by which the government determines upon the position that it's prepared to stand on in court in any litigation. And that's quite important, that it's a position the government is prepared to stand on in court. In the course of the case, for the reasons that the committee's been aware, the government took the view that it was not prepared to stand on the ground that it conceded.
Take you back to the legal advice, and I understand your limitations, but in response to a parliamentary question, I was told that you have indeed given information on legal advice to a number of inquiries, including the child abuse inquiry, the contaminated blood inquiry. I'm just wondering why you can't give legal advice to a parliamentary inquiry.
Yes, I'm aware of the parliamentary question and the answer.
I'm sure you were consulted on it.
And I couldn't possibly comment on whether I was or wasn't.
No, indeed. That would be legal advice, wouldn't it?
Well, and also the government does not disclose the involvement of law officers or their non-involvement in any particular matter.
I'll pretend you're not here then.
But I suppose there's an important point there that ultimately I answer, I'm ministerially responsible for the government's legal advice, whoever gave it. And therefore, in a sense, which particular lawyer said what to whom is neither here nor there, because ultimately I answer for that legal advice. But to come back to the member's question, I suppose what that answer reveals is just how rare it is that the government waives its position. That's 3 occasions since devolution, and I should say I've been made aware of one additional case where in the very first bill that was before this Parliament in debate, that was a case, an emergency bill responding to a decision of the Sheriff Court in relation to the release of an inpatient from Carstairs. The then Lord Advocate Lord Hardy disclosed the content and source of legal advice in the course of debate. So to the effect there was no legal means for reviewing the Sheriff's decision.
But you'll appreciate, sorry to interrupt you, you'll appreciate, you've revealed it in the past. This is a parliamentary inquiry involving the current First Minister, the former First Minister, the Perm Sec, on what basis would you withhold it from a parliamentary inquiry? Are we not as important as a judicial inquiry? Does democratic accountability not count?
I think I wouldn't for a moment suggest that, and the member wouldn't suggest that. In fact, on the contrary, I recognise the importance of democratic accountability. Of course, ministers appear in Parliament on the basis of a set of constitutional principles, which I outlined in my opening statement. And I suppose what's really important to say is that the assertion of legal professional privilege is routine. Its waiver is exceptionally rare. And that it happens against the background of very strong reasons of public policy to maintain that that confidentiality, which facilitates and encourages the seeking and receipt of legal advice by policymakers and ministers on a basis of absolute candour. And I'd be concerned as a law officer about any weakening of that position, which might disincentivize the proper involvement of lawyers in policy making.
But I'm sure you would agree these are exceptional circumstances.
I think as Mr. Allen's question revealed, litigation with government is not particularly exceptional.
Parliamentary inquiries into
high-profile litigation is not exceptional. It's particularly important that in the context of a litigation that government is, where inevitably the government's previous legal position may come under scrutiny and test, that the government is not disincentivized from seeking and obtaining on the basis of absolute candour legal advice. It's also fair to say that the more an issue is a matter of live political debate, the greater the risk that a waiver for privilege would undermine that. There's structures that are in place which are designed to support the public interest in good government, and which are designed to ensure that the government, as far as it can, lives up to its commitment to acting in accordance with the law and in the proper administration of justice.
Sure, thank you. I'm conscious that the convener will shout at me if I take too long, so let me rattle through these. Going back to the 17 meetings that you weren't aware of how many there were, did you attend any of them, most of them, all of them?
It'd be, as I said earlier, the government doesn't disclose the involvement or non-involvement of law officers in any particular
so you could
matter.
have been there. Okay.
The member, no, I'm sorry, the member should take nothing.
Okay, I'll take nothing from it.
One way or the other. I'm not, you know.
Let
the
me
government
ask the
simply
Permanent
doesn't-
Secretary then, because she can answer, whether she was at these meetings.
I wasn't at all 17 meetings, no.
Okay, you were at some of them then.
I was at a few.
Okay, you were at a few. Could you tell us who else was there, aside from law officers, because we shouldn't know that? Were special advisors ever there?
I don't know, not during the time that the meetings that I was
Okay.
at that I can recall, no.
Okay, can somebody provide us a list of those who were there, if it's appropriate to do so?
If
Was
it's
the
appropriate
First
to do so,
Minister
we'll
ever
do
there?
so. I can give you a list of who might
Okay.
have been there, if I'm
And
allowed to do that.
Could you answer if the First Minister was also there?
The First Minister was present with me at 2 meetings that I can recall.
Okay. Is it normal for First Ministers to get involved in judicial reviews? Discussions
This is the
about
only
them?
judicial review I have been involved in, so I
Okay.
can't comment on that.
Oh, so you don't know about precedent in the organisation? I certainly can't remember any First Minister being involved.
I
And
don't
I'm
have a
assuming it's
corporate
not-
memory of that kind, but I don't think you should read anything into it.
Okay, well, perhaps if you could advise the committee, that would be helpful. Can I go back to the Lord Advocate? Sorry, you didn't get off so lightly. We obviously have a letter from Levy and McRae from acting on behalf of the former First Minister, and they say quite clearly in it that the Scottish Government's position, which was that, you know, obtaining documents is a matter for the courts, is in some way incorrect, because actually all the documents you provide, because you initiated it, they're the government's documents that you provided, actually could be provided to the committee subject to the appropriate redactions. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I should say I was grateful for sight of that letter just before I came in. I mean, I suppose what that letter does reveal is that, you know, this is not an entirely straightforward process.
Indeed.
I think the member would
We're
accept,
understanding
I
that.
think the member would accept that, and I made the point in answer to earlier questions that the committee's asked for a very significant volume of different categories of documents relating to the judicial review. Different issues arise in relation to each of those. There are other parties as well as the court's interest. As I've told the committee, the government is actively looking at the steps that it can proactively take to enable as much of that material as possible to be made available to the committee. I hope that enables material to be made available to the committee.
Okay. I'm hoping that as a consequence probably of your intervention that the committee is now going to get to see at least something, whether it's a chronology or whether it's all the documents that are appropriate. We will just need to wait and see. But do you believe that withholding of these documents, other than those that should naturally be redacted, would be an unacceptable level of secrecy on the part of the Scottish Government?
Can I first of all say that the member should not infer any particular level of involvement or non-involvement on my part.
Indeed.
For the reasons that
That's
we've already
secret too?
for the reasons we've already discussed. But the government's made clear its commitment to assisting the committee as fully as it can. The Deputy First Minister in his letter, I think, made clear that in relation to those particular documents, the government would take steps to enable the committee to have access, and I think he used the words so far as possible to them. Now, the committee is well aware there are constraints and there are other interests that have to be accommodated and properly, that properly need to be taken into account. But you have there the Deputy First Minister's commitment in relation to those steps, and I can confirm that those steps are being
Thank you.
are being actively looked at.
A couple of very small final questions to the Permanent Secretary, if I may. You spoke about the cost of the litigation in relation to the settlement for the former First Minister at £512,000 or thereabouts. Could you tell us the total cost to the Scottish Government? I'm thinking of in-house lawyers, civil servants, senior counsel. I don't know if you have that figure to hand. If you don't, then I would be happy if you would write to the committee about that.
I don't have that figure to hand.
Okay, I suspected so. I thought it was a level of detail too far. And finally, you know, I'm very conscious that you apologise to the committee for introducing an unlawful policy. Would you also like to apologise for costing the taxpayer an extraordinary amount of money?
I think I've made my apology.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener.
I have a short supplementary from Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. Just picking up on Jackie Bailey's point, we know the government can waive legal privilege, and if the exceptional circumstances aren't a failed contest or a judicial review costing in excess of £500,000, and dear knows how much more, and a trial against a former First Minister and involving the most powerful people in the land, from the Lord Advocate to the Permanent Secretary onwards, if that doesn't constitute public interest for waiving legal privilege, then what on earth does? This is an inquiry which I think must be one of the most serious that the Scotland and the Scottish Parliament has ever seen. So can you tell me what would trump the circumstances that we're looking at? Because it seems to me the public interest is being denied the accountability it should have. Lord Advocate.
I think the first point to make is that there's nothing in the principles upon which government deals with Parliament that prevents full accountability for the decisions that government took in relation to this, any more than any other decision-making process, and indeed for the legal position that government adopts. That accountability does not depend on disclosure of internal legal advice or which particular lawyer gave advice at which particular time. The government can stand or fall on the position that it took in the judicial review, and the committee can examine and test that. So that's the first point, that accountability can be secured without revelation of that material. It's very important, certainly from my perspective, it's very important to recognise that there is no simple test in relation to the very unusual waiver of privilege. Waiver of privilege is something that sometimes would be politically very convenient for ministers, but all governments of all political persuasions across the United Kingdom hold very firmly to the importance of maintaining it. And they do so because it is part of a structure, along with the responsibility of government lawyers, ultimately with the law officers at the apex of that system. It's part of a structure that helps to ensure that government properly absorbs legal considerations into its decision-making on any issue, whether it be a matter of policy or in the context of a litigation. As I said earlier, there are particular pressures that arise in the context of litigation, and it would not be appropriate to take steps that would undermine the ability of government to seek and to obtain on the basis of absolute candour the legal advice that it needs, whether internally or externally, on any particular matter. And part of the reason for that is precisely to avoid the question of whether government has or hasn't taken legal advice, or who it took it from, or what the advice was, becoming itself an issue that is politicised.
Can I very briefly just clarify, are you trying to say to the committee that if ministers come and explain the legal advice, that's equivalent to getting the actual legal advice which they may have decided to ignore?
The key point is that governments are accountable, as they always are in Parliament, for the legal position that the government takes. That position may...
Forgive me, I think that was a yes or no answer.
Well,
is it the same? A minister's coming to explain legal advice and the government and this inquiry having sight of the actual legal advice, which they may or may not have ignored. It's not the same, is it?
Yes, I think with respect, it's not a...
Can I just say here that even I, as a non-legal lay person, wouldn't like to answer yes and no to that. So please, Lord Advocate.
I'm grateful, Convener. What I've been trying to, and perhaps not, you know, it's my fault not conveying, is that the government either implicitly or explicitly takes a legal position when it adopts a policy decision. There will be legal positions underpinning that policy decision. In a litigation, there is a legal position that the government takes. Ministers are answerable and accountable for that legal position. They may be told by the court they are wrong. They may be tested on it by a parliamentary inquiry or in Parliament more generally. That's a different thing from the process by which that position is arrived at. And the purpose of the legal professional privilege, litigation privilege, law officer convention, recognised by courts routinely as having a key importance in protecting the rule of law, sound administration of justice and good government. Those doctrines protect the ability of government to seek and obtain on an absolutely candid basis the legal advice it needs. Perhaps competing legal advice, perhaps with different views being expressed by different people, and ultimately the government taking a decision as to what its legal position should be, and then standing or falling on that position publicly. So I'm sorry it's taken a little longer than a yes or a no, but I'm afraid that's my answer to the member's question.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of things I'd just like to pick up on to wrap up the meeting. First of all, with the Permanent Secretary. I know, Permanent Secretary, that you're going to look at some of the evidence that was given here and write to the committee with various details. It was just to draw your attention to, in relation to Maureen Watt's questions, the government's statement on the judicial review actually notes that special advisors, amongst others, were involved in aspects of this case. So it's just to refresh yourself of that, paragraph 32.
I think, not to prolong this, Convener,
yes,
I think
please.
that Ms Watt's question was particularly to do with the judicial review.
Yes.
But of course, if information that needs to come back to
Yes.
the committee includes the role of special advisors, we would certainly include
Yes, I
that
would
in our
appreciate
evidence,
that.
of course.
Yes, thank you very much. And Lord Advocate, there has been reference all the way through this session to additional information that we hope will come from government based on the Deputy First Minister's letter and the chronological list. But you did say the greatest extent possible. And I just wondered who defines what is the greatest extent possible and what this committee should now receive automatically.
Yes. I should perhaps on the last, on the convener's previous point, I mean, it may well be that I'll be looking at that paragraph corrected in relation to the role of special advisors. As I'm afraid I can't personally help the committee any further with that question. Well, as the committee is aware, there are a number of constraints that need to be recognised, and I think we all understand those. The production of court documents is something that the government is proactively looking at how it can reveal as much of that material as possible. Those are the Deputy First Minister's words. I can't perhaps amplify on them. Clearly, the particularities of the documents will have to be looked at against the range of restrictions and matters that need to be protected. As I say, I'm not sure I can elaborate further on that commitment.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we have repeatedly requested is a list of the documents that the government holds. Surely that's something that could be given to us, along with the chronology.
I'm perhaps not the person who's best able to answer precisely what issues there may or may not be about providing particular lists. I mean, I could see that questions might arise simply from the identification of a document that might trespass across one or more of the boundaries that have been set by the committee itself and by other factors on the inquiry. Whether that's the case or not, I'm afraid, is not something I can answer, but it may be that the government can write further on that specific issue.
And perhaps the Permanent Secretary might like to respond to that last point, you know, bearing in mind that this committee has been extremely careful in what is published in terms of redactions, and in fact has been more stringent in its redactions and publication than the government has been in the publishing of their freedom of information requests. So,
Convener, I would say we have been equally careful about how we have redacted material. So we have looked at that very carefully to make sure that we have not been overly cautious with but responsible and disciplined in our redaction. I don't think there's anything else that I can add to in terms of the release of
what about the list of documents that the government
I would need to be advised about whether that's possible or not. If it is, in legal terms, then I'm happy to do that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And can I say thank you very much to the Lord Advocate and the Permanent Secretary for the attendance today. I think it was the Lord Advocate's words that said that this was an exploratory session. So the committee will take a decision further on in this aspect of our inquiry about who will be invited to give evidence. So that concludes the public evidence session for today, and we'll now move into private session.